In the near future, the Vasa Museum will build a large and comprehensive new support structure for the ship. This will accommodate the massive weight of the ship much better than the existing structure. It will include a cradle on the outside of the ship, but also a fairly complex and comprehensive interior support structure of beams and pipes and support plates that will obscure a lot of the original surface area inside the ship, and will no longer allow the ship to give the impression of an original 17th century interior. Before we begin the process of constructing that interior framework, we think it's important that we go through the ship room by room and you do a proper documentation of that space, both for academic purposes, and so there's a project that is looking at the interior and documenting every square centimeter of every surface, photographically, electronically, hand note-taking. But also we need to document the experience, the function, the presence of those interior spaces. And so this series of films will be a record of what each one of the interior spaces of the ship was, how we believe it was used, what parts of it are original, and what interesting features might survive. So let's go on board. Those of us who work on board on a regular basis have to take special care to make sure that we don't cause any damage to the ship. One of the things we have to think about is where we walk. Our feet are causing constant abrasion to the surface. And so some years ago we carried out a project to discover what would be the best shoes to wear if we were going to work on board on a regular basis. They had to have enough grip that it was safe for us to walk, but also not so much grip that it would grind up the deck. And these shoes would stay on the ship, they'd never leave, so we wouldn't track any dirt into the ship. And after trying a bunch of different things, rock climbing shoes, special shoes for floor polishing, that sort of thing, we eventually settled on these. Bowling shoes. They're cheap, they're relatively comfortable, but they have a flat sole with no tread, and they have just the right amount of grip so that we can walk safely but not damage the decks. And so all of us have a pair of shoes that stay on the ship, they never leave, so that we never have to worry about tracking external dirt into the ship. Ready to go anywhere on board. Here in the stern, all the way up at the top of the stern castle, we have a number of smaller compartments that were used mostly as accommodation for the officers and other specialized members of the crew. This part of the ship had been broken down very much in the years that the ship lay on the bottom, and so it's been reassembled from its original pieces. But it's still substantially complete, even up to very lightweight timbers like the fife rails along the sides. The uppermost of the compartments in this area is through this little door behind me. On an English ship it would be called the coach. On an English ship this is where the trumpeters or drummers would live on board, but we're not really sure what happened here on Vasa. We don't have any artifacts associated with this room, nor do we have that English tradition. Let's go inside and take a look at just what a cramped little space this is. You can see how small this space is. I'm 1.80 meters tall. That's as tall as the tallest sailor we know of from the ship. The average height was much shorter, about 1.65 meters, 1.66 meters. So even a Vasa sailor couldn't have stood up in this space. We don't really know how it was used. It might have been a flag locker. That is a later tradition in the Swedish Navy. There doesn't seem to be, this is not a great place to live, I don't think, but might only be a modern impression. Quite a bit of the interior here is not original. You can see the dark planking on the sides is not. But the bulkhead that defines it, this very fine curved shape, very typical of the period, is mostly original bits with a door. There was an open and closing swinging door here, which we don't currently have. And then a large part of the deck has disappeared. But the space is very much what we believe it to have been. The deck structure above all of these beams are original. You can see it's very lightly built. The deck above is a very light structure indeed. And you had to do that because the higher up in the ship you are, the more effect weight has on the stability. And they were clearly thinking about that because of making the structure lighter as you go up farther. I'm standing here on the roof of the steerage, and this, we believe, is where the ship's officers, the captain and the 2 lieutenants, lived. Those cabins could be reached by these 2 low doors and down a short ladder. This whole area was somewhat altered during the construction of the ship. We can see, for example, that the placement of these doors and this deck originally ended a little bit farther aft, about 1.5 meters to 2 meters farther aft, and that the mizzenmast was also thought to be, or intended to be, farther aft. And everything was shifted forward in the process of building the ship. We can see those alterations. It's the only major alteration we know of in the process of building the ship. That complex of rooms also had access to the cabin below through a staircase, but this was the primary avenue of access. And this is the area where the officers worked. The captain stood here on these decks to command the ship. So let's go see the captain's and lieutenant's quarters. Well, now we're in the first of the 3 rooms that belong to the officers' accommodation. This might be the antechamber, you could call it. It's a strange little room. It's not very long, a little less than 2 meters front to back. And it does have the mizzenmast in the middle of it, which takes up quite a lot of space. It's just long enough to put bunks in, so it might have been accommodation for some people. Unfortunately, we don't have very much of its interior very well identified yet, so we're not entirely sure how this space might have been used. It is possible that this space is an afterthought, a secondary construction that resulted from the alteration of this entire structure. That when they extended the deck above, they extended it just about this length. And so it may have been the case at the start that this was intended to be the forward end of these cabins, and that when the deck was extended, it created this space underneath. But if we go through this nice door with an arched header to it, we'll come into the main part of the accommodation, which is much more spacious, and in some senses, one might even say luxurious. The officers' accommodation on Vasa were for the captain and the lieutenants, that is the ship's officers, lived primarily in these 2 rooms, we believe. An admiral or the king would have the even finer accommodation on the deck below in the great cabin. This cabin had several features built specifically for the comfort of the people who lived here. We know that, for example, there were a number of built-in benches along the sides of this particular room that had fold-out double beds built into them. That you could fold up during the day and have as a bench, and then fold them down and there would be a mattress inside. This room also has windows, a little arched window on either side, and even some very nice comforts of home. If one looks very closely at the frame or the lintel to the door, there's a series of small tack holes that run all the way around. And these are probably for a curtain that was nailed here, and that could be used either with the door open to provide a little privacy, or with the door closed and the curtain draped over it. It was a very effective draft excluder to keep the inside of the cabin a little warmer. This suite of rooms is divided into 2 main spaces. This lower space, a little farther forward, is probably the place where the officers slept. This is where we believe the fold-out beds were. And then up a little step, they had a second room, probably for eating their meals or as a kind of sitting room or day cabin. In addition, there was a staircase down on the port side that provided private communication with the great cabin below, so that the officers of the ship and the fleet could talk to each other or visit each other without having to go out into the ship with the general population of the crew. These 2 rooms are divided by a bulkhead, the frame of which we have here, but this was planked over, probably vertical planks. And there was probably a doorway, but we don't think there's a physical door in this space, but we haven't or at least we haven't found it. And then if we step up a step, we come into a sitting room. Here all the way in the stern, the officers had a kind of sitting room. There's seating, but there also in this room was found the remains of a wooden table in pine, a little bit less than 2 meters long and about 1 meter wide, which would have been big enough for 6 people to sit and eat at. This space has light. There are 4 windows in the stern. These were closed with wooden shutters. They didn't have glass in them. We do have one of the shutters for these windows. There's also a built-in bench or a settee that runs across the back of the cabin underneath these 4 windows. You can see remains of the seat and the backrest here. There are some small tack holes in this suggest that the seat may even have been upholstered, stuffed, and covered with fabric, although that's, I would have to say, a little inconclusive. On each side, there's a quarter gallery, a small balcony on the outside, which was a typical feature of ships of this period. It's a bit of a symbol of the prestige of the people who lived there. And in fact, these might have been almost purely symbolic. The upper galleries are very, very cramped. They're so small that a normal-sized person can't really move around in them very effectively. If I crawl in there to try to record something, I have to decide which way I want to face before I go through the door, because I can't really turn around once I get in there. So this is about how you have to stand in this little gallery. The main interior space of the ship is on 4 decks that run the full length of the ship: the upper and lower gun decks, the orlop, and the hold. This staircase is where there was a ladder originally that led from here, the upper deck or the main deck or the weather deck, down to the first of the interior decks, the upper gun deck.